This will be the draft of my second sermon for preaching in the Purple Zone, based on the lectionary for October 22nd. A few weeks ago, there was a gathering of all the ELCA Lutheran pastors and deacons in the whole state of Iowa. It was an educational event with a couple different speakers. One was a Lutheran bishop, and the other was a freelance theologian. And the freelance theologian began her presentation by asking this entire room full of church professionals, what is the gospel in one sentence? And it wasn't a rhetorical exercise. She literally wanted people to shout out answers. And she had a correct answer in mind. So it was a pretty intense little moment. Glad I was an intern in that space, not one of the four bishops among the crowd who everyone looked to have the perfect right answer. And eventually someone shouted out, "Jesus is God's love come to earth." Her response was, "No, that's not what I'm looking for." A second guess, "Jesus is the one who forgives sins." And again, her response was, "That's a nice statement and it's true, but it's not what I'm looking for. It's not the heart of the gospel." And so the room got pretty quiet as people were afraid to keep being wrong. After all, this was the primary job for all of us, and so nobody wants to look like a fool in front of all their colleagues. So eventually the speaker spoke into the silence. "Folks," she said, "the dead guy didn't stay dead. Jesus is risen. That's the gospel at its heart. And here's the deal," she said, "because God has raised Jesus from the dead, it confirms that God and Jesus shared the same agenda. And so everything that Jesus was up to on earth, it's all in line with God's plan too. It's a giant affirmation. When God raises Jesus from the dead, it's a way of God saying that everything that Jesus was up to, it's all part of God's agenda too. In other words, the resurrection of Jesus the Christ gives all of his earthly actions a big-time source of authority. Because of the resurrection, we know that God is on the same agenda as Christ. And it's so important to remember that this wasn't always true. It wasn't always seen this way as Jesus was walking around. Nobody wrote down these gospel stories while Jesus was alive. They compiled them after his resurrection. And the reason why is that all of a sudden, everything that Jesus had done gained so much authority after the fact of the resurrection. They realized then this is truly God's chosen Messiah, and so all the things that Jesus did are things that God too cares about. And on that agenda for today, for this 22nd chapter in Matthew, Jesus is speaking about a question of taxes and economics and stewardship and just who owns all things in creation. Is it a matter of us owning them? Is it a matter of God owning them? And there's no getting around the paradoxical response that Jesus gives to those who test him this week. Give to Caesar what is due Caesar, and give to God the things that are God's. Now, so often in stories, Peter immediately speaks up the natural human question that I think that often all of us are all thinking, but maybe are too afraid to ask. And Peter is so helpful this way in Scripture. A few weeks ago, we heard a story where Jesus was speaking about forgiveness, and we hear this question, how many times do I have to forgive? And that's Peter's question, naming the question maybe before all of us. Different story, a few weeks even before that, Jesus is describing how he must suffer a terrible death. And it's Peter who shouts out very bravely, "Oh, God forbid it, Lord, that you would have to suffer." Again, something that maybe we would want to say, want to submit into the story. And Peter names that. It's Peter who at the moment of the transfiguration says very proudly to God, let's build a nice house up here and all stay safe when there's Jesus and Elijah and Moses and this great trio of folks. And Peter says what all of us would say, let's celebrate this moment, let's stay here, let's stay secure. And this morning when we hear another tough parable, a story about taxes and trying to prove Jesus wrong, we hear this line from Jesus, to give to God what is due God. The natural question that comes to mind for me and maybe for you is, well, so what are the things that are God's? But Peter's not around, at least today, to ask the question for us. But even as the question forms in my mouth, I know the answer, that everything belongs to God. And to give to God what is owned by God is to give everything to God. And we all know that from the first few chapters of Genesis, that it's God who is the creator of this world. But if we're being honest, we don't think of our possessions as all being owned by God. It's my Google Calendar or my family schedule at home, and I choose time for God activities or choose time for doing other things that I like to do. It's my bank account, and I choose to give some of it away. It's my prized car or my collector's baseball card or my favorite antique or my favorite whatever. But it's not God's. We think of our possessions as being owned by us. And yet God reminds us this week to remember who the Creator is and who you are. Everything belongs to God, and we owe everything to God. And while that's true, we are also granted the ability to make choices. Choices about how we spend or save, choices about who we give our coins to, who we don't give our coins to, who we boycott. And these collective judgments that we make, they impact our national economy every day. And in this battle of greed versus grace, in the wake of a recession where greed won, and where care for others lost, and where so many were affected. And if you want to know truly how evil it was, you can watch the film The Big Short and truly be shocked by the power of envy in the world. But also in a time when working a full-time job at Iowa's minimum wage will earn you an annual income of $15,000, and the federal poverty level is $25,000 for a family of 4. Or in a time when the gap between the rich and the poor is insanely big, where the top 8 people in the world, the wealthiest 8 people in the world, have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world. 8 people's wealth equals the wealth of 3.6 billion people. In a time when healthcare costs force so many families deep into debt, in a time when everything in the world belongs to God, and where congregations strive to harness collective generosity to make the world a better place, where do we put our coins? What is owed to God? What is owed to other places? And what about the risk of generosity with so many rising costs? Those are some real questions. They're real questions worth asking. They're real questions worth asking in our own prayer life. They're questions worth digging into as a community together. And I hope you'll be a part of a gathering this weekend that will do just that. During adult learning time this morning, we'll be lifting up the question of what it means to be economically secure as an individual or family unit, or as a country, or as a community. And all are invited to join that conversation to think about some tangible pathways forward. And that's a conversation that will be happening in partnership with some community organizers here in the city of Des Moines. But for this moment, with all those economical questions, I find it helpful to go back to that core gospel. Jesus is risen. And by the way, that's a cue. Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. And we celebrate that promise, that Easter promise, every Sunday when we gather. And when we know this good news in our gut, it changes everything. For us who know that death does not win, there is more to do with our lives than preserve them. For us who know that death does not win, there is more to do with our lives than preserve them. And Christian living after the resurrection of Jesus invites us to transform in the biggest way possible. Instead of looking out first for me, myself, and I, we dare to look out for each other. And that means a transformation of how we think about money, not just about what I need, but about what I can give out of delight for what God has already done in the resurrection of Christ. We form communities of love because we are no longer captivated and controlled only by self-preservation. And this work is so very hard, and how very important it is too. Jesus is risen, transforms worldly economic wisdom, and instead reminds us that all we are and all we have already belong to God, who created them in the first place. And so in response to that gift of who we are and what we have, we strive to become people of uncommon generosity, of uncommon sacrifice, because it isn't just a game of self-preservation for us anymore. The Christian is radically oriented to the other. We are the people walking around who represent Christ 2,000 years after he has ascended into heaven. And it's a discipline that's really hard. It's one that we're not very good at. It's so hard to admit that everything I've worked for, it all belongs to God. One of my professors tells this great story that he admits may or may not be historically accurate, but this is a history class, and so I'm telling it anyway. There's a story told about this group of people. They were called the Gauls. And the Gauls, that's Gauls, they were a group of people living between modern France and Belgium, but this was a long time ago, back at the time of the Roman Empire. It was a time when Christianity was just beginning, and they had been conquered by the Romans. They were living under Roman control, but they were also one of the people who were most physically resistant to that outside authority, that outside power. And they often had various uprisings to break out and try and overthrow the Romans, which never was successful, but they tried nonetheless. And at some point, in the early history of the church, some Christian missionaries bravely arrived, and over time, some of the Gauls converted to this new religion. And now here's where the story gets really interesting. Whenever a new Gaul decided to jump on board with the Christian faith, he or she would be baptized as an entrance rite into the life of discipleship. That's true for all of us. We would expect that part. And the community practiced full immersion baptism. They'd go to a local river and do these baptisms. But whenever a Gaul was baptized, their whole body would be submerged, but they would either keep their left arm or their right arm out of the water. And this was an odd thing. It was an odd thing for the missionaries to encounter. It seemed peculiar, but of course many parts of a culture are strange, and so nobody really asked questions. But then one day, a new uprising broke out against Rome, and a whole bunch of new converts grabbed a weapon in one hand, and they loudly proclaimed, "This arm is not baptized," and they went off to destroy the enemy in a most unchristian manner. Now, of course, to us, it's a comical image, this idea that, 2 legs and 1 arm would be baptized, but not the rest of the body or something like that. Of course, that's not true. We believe that baptism is a one-time thing. It's a full-body thing. It's a changing moment where we follow in the footsteps of Christ. My professor always challenges us, and he tells this story by comparing it to today, where if we were modern-day Gauls, we too would hold an arm out of the water, not to hold a weapon, to keep a wallet or a purse dry. We are people who resist this idea that all we are and all we have belong to God. And it's such a difficult idea. It's hard for us to imagine that full immersion of discipleship. And my professor also always reminds students and faithful people that in the world of the ELCA, this is true across our entire system, that the average ELCA Lutheran gives 2% of their income. And in other words, there is a hesitation to keep finances dry and apart from the life of baptism that is marked by a call to be outwardly generous. At the end of the day, Jesus invites us to stomach this idea, to give to God what is God's, so that we remember that all of us, it all already belongs to God. It's a moment where Jesus is trying to pry open the kingdom of the self, and instead to beckon us toward a call that comes to recognize the great love of God, the risen Christ, proclaiming that love, and that we are invited to live for the kingdom, live for communities, not to live for individual things, but to live for others. This is a way that is marked by those who are seized by a hope of the gospel, that very core that the dead guy didn't stay dead. And because of that, we too live not just for ourselves, but for a larger dream, a kingdom-sized dream. And what we do with our various coins in the marketplace is attached to that whole body vocation of serving in generous ways and serving a resurrected Christ. Give to God what is due God, says Jesus. In other words, knowing that we have more to do with our lives than preserve them. We aren't just astounded by Jesus like the people in the story who hear one speech of such profound generosity, but we too astound others because we live differently. We live different ways of worldly economic wisdom. We live to astound others by following our risen Lord, by putting his path of shocking generosity, by claiming that in ourselves and walking that road together.